Factorial with a range. Now let's see the factorial with a range function. Example number 1. For I in range of 1, 5, 1, factorial equals to 1. For j in range of 1, I plus 1, factorial equals to factorial times j. Try the print of factorial. When you run it, you will get 1, 2, 6, 24, 120. That's what we got the output here. Now look at here. It is factorial with the range function. We have used a range function 2 times here and here. And at the same time, it is a nested loop. We have adjusted one loop inside the another loop, one loop inside the another loop. This is the inner loop and this is the outer loop. We have adjusted the inner loop inside the outer loop. That's why we call it nested loop. And also we have used for loop. This is the for loop for the outer, this is the outermost for loop, and this is the inner for loop. For the outer for loop, we have for I in the range of 1, 5 plus 1. Make sure the range is from 1 up to 5. The initial point is 1 and ending point is 5. It has been incremented by 1. Initially, factorial equals to 1. Initial stage of the factorial is 1 here, initial point. And then the inner loop is for j in the range of 1, I plus 1. This is the inner loop. What the inner loop does, in the inner loop, this is the range from 1 up to I. From 1 up to I will be the range. What is actually I? I is the individual item of the outer loop here, of this range. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4. This 1, 2, 3, 4, these are the individual items. These are actually I. So in the second loop, this I stands for the individual items of this range. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the individual items. So they are represented, but make sure it has been also incremented by 1. So here is the factorial formula. We have factorial equals to factorial times j. Factorial times j. This will be the formula. When you take the print of factorial, you will get this output here. Now you might be confused that what is the magic? How the process works. First, the outer loop activates. It iterates over each and every single item of the first range function. So it first iterates over the first item, which is 1, because factorial initially equals to 1. So this is the initial point. It will give 1 in the output, 1 in the output. Then the inner loop will activate. So it will iterate over the first item, which is 1 here. Therefore we got 1 here. And then again the outer loop will activate. It will activate for the second time, for the second item. The second item after 1 is 2. So at the same time, then the inner loop will activate. It will iterate over the second item. So the second item here is actually I. Now look at here. When you look to the formula, initially factorial equals to 1. Factorial equals to 1. So we will have 1 times 2, the second value. The second value is 2. Therefore we will have 1 times 2. And then the outer loop will iterate for the third time, for the third element, which will be 3. And then the inner loop will iterate. According to the inner loop, we have actually 3 here, 3 here. So I is 3 at this time. Because the outer loop was iterated for the 3, for the third item. The third item was 3. Therefore, the I is 3 by the time. We have j. What is j? J is the representation of the individual item of this range function. In formula, we have factorial equals to 1. So we will have 1 times 2 times 3. What is j? J is actually the representation of these items. This is the j. We have factorial times j. So for the 6, we're going to have 1, because factorial equals to 1, times 2 times 3. Because the previous value was 2 and then it has been incremented by the 3. So we will have 1, which is factorial, times 2 times 3. And then the for loop will iterate for the fourth item, which is 4. Since the I is 4 by this time. And then look to the formula. We're going to have factorial, which is 1. So 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. Because remember, the previous value was 3. So it has been incremented by 1. Therefore, we'll have 4 here. We're going to have 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. So this 24 is because of 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. It is because of this factorial formula. And then it iterates for the fifth time. for the fifth item, which is 5. So now the element is 5, and then the inner loop iterates for the j here. As the previous value was 4, it has been incremented by 1 now. So we're gonna have 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. It equals to 120. Now look at here. The outer loop iterates for the outer side, and the inner loop iterates for the inner side. For example, during first iteration we have 1. The inner loop will iterate for the inner side, like 1 is actually 1 times 1. And then for the second iteration we have 2 here for the outer loop. But at the same time the inner loop iterates as well. So we're gonna have 1 times 2, 1 times 2, it equals to 2. For the third iteration we have 3, but at the same time the inner loop iterates. So we're gonna have 1 times 2 times 3. This 1 times 2 times 3. These three values are because of the inner iteration, inner loop iteration. So when you take the product of 1 times 2 times 3, you will get 6 answer. Look, at this point 3 is only from the outer loop, but the rest of the process is because of the inner loop, like 1 times 2 times 3. This 1 times 2 times 3 repeats all the time for the inner loop. The outer loop iterates for the fourth value, which is 4. At this point we have 4. 4 comes out only from the outer loop. But then we have the inner loop as well, it iterates. We have the inner iteration, so we're gonna have the repetition process for the inner loop, like 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. So the process will repeat again and again for the inner loop, from the initial point up to that specific point. That specific point is 4 at this stage. So we'll have 1 times 2 times 3 times 4, which is because of this inner loop. Because remember, for the inner loop, the range always starts from 1 up to I. What is I? I is that specific number and will increment it by 1. And then with this formula. When the for loop activates for the last item, which is 5, at this point, only 5 comes out from the outer loop. But then the inner loop iterates. The inner loop iterates all the process from the initial point up to that specific point. Initial point is 1. So based on this formula, which is factorial times j, factorial is 1, you will have always 1 here. So we'll have 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. 5 is that specific number. So when you take the product, you will get 120. 120 is the answer. That's how factorial works. This is the logic of the factorial. So I hope the concept is clear by now. Example number 1. Let me take again the same example, but this time I'm going to put a. For a in range of 1, 5 plus 1, factorial equals to 1. For b in range of 1, a plus 1, factorial equals to factorial times b. Print out factorial, you will get the same output. Now look at here, it is just a matter of name. You can put n, you can put a, you can put b, you can put c, whatever you want, you can put it. So for the factorial, inside you can put fact. You can also simply put f. It is up to you. It is also just the variable name. I repeat this thing again and again. For variable, you can put any name. Variable is just the name. It is just the identifier. So it can be a, b, c, d, whatever you want. Similarly, this can be b, can be d, can be c, can be f. This fact is actually this fact. But make sure whatever name you have here, you have to put it the same name inside the print function. If you have fact, you have to put fact. If you have c, you have to put c. If you have f, you have to put f. If you have full factorial name, you have to put full factorial name here. So when you run it, you got exactly the same answer. So it is exactly the same output what we got last time. So I'm just showing you and I'm just repeating you again and again that look, don't be confused. It doesn't affect the program. These are just the variable names. So don't worry.